you want to get a spiritual GPS reading on them. You want to know what their whys and wherefores are and how they put their life together, what drives them, what are their values, those kinds of things. So I'm in conversation. Initially, my doctrinal meter is on mute. Okay, not going to turn it off, okay, because it's going to go off. Tilt button will be there, okay? But what normally happens when you hit the tilt button is, I've got to form my rebuttal and tell them why they're wrong. No, I actually want first to figure out why they see the world the way that they do and how they put it together. Because in the midst of that, I may discover the bridges that I can focus on to have a good conversation.
Yeah.
And when I create an environment where I make the effort to get to know them and listen to their story, I also create an environment for when it's my turn, I get to tell my story.
One of the current greatest challenges for Christians is engaging with others who may hold very different views. When you're at work or school and a contentious topic comes up, do you listen silently or engage aggressively or somewhere in between? Are there better ways to engage with our neighbors, coworkers, and classmates in this increasingly pluralistic and polarized cultural moment? That's what we're talking about today on the theFormed.life podcast. I'm Bill Gorman, Brookside campus pastor.
And I'm Paul Brandis, Shawnee campus pastor. And on this episode, Dr. Darrell Bock shares with us how we can develop a deep cultural intelligence. Dr. Bock is the Executive Director of Cultural Engagement, and he's a Senior Research Professor of New Testament Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary. He's a New York Times bestselling author of over 40 books, including well-regarded commentaries on Luke and Acts, as well as studies of the historical Jesus and quite a bit of work in cultural engagement. He has served as the president of the Evangelical Theological Society. Additionally, he served as a consulting editor for Christianity Today while serving on the boards of Wheaton College and Chosen People Ministries.
Yes, in one of his most recent books, titled Cultural Intelligence, Living for God in a Diverse, Pluralistic World, Dr. Bock walks through how Christians can become more adept at understanding culture and relating winsomely and faithfully with our neighbors. And that book forms the foundation of our conversation in this episode. Dr. Bock brings incredible insight and a lot of passion to this topic, so let's jump in right now. Well, Dr. Bock, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today on the theFormed.life podcast. We're really glad that you are here. And I've just benefited from your scholarship so much in my own pastoral ministry over the years, from the time I was a Bible college student through seminary. And I think probably your 2-volume commentary on Acts Luke is the biggest book on my shelf in my office. So I'm so grateful for your work. And whenever
it keeps me in shape by pulling it down every now and then.
That's right. We're just so thankful for this. So thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Well, today we'd love to talk a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing more recently around cultural engagement and how Christians can think biblically, theologically about engaging intelligently with the culture around us. And obviously we're not totally separate from that culture. We're also a part of it. But how can we as Christians engage intelligently in that? And so in the first chapter of your book, which is called Cultural Intelligence, Living for God in a Diverse, Pluralistic World, the first kind of part of that, you develop a theology of cultural intelligence. So I'd love to just even define, what do we mean when we're talking about cultural intelligence? And maybe kind of the 2 words, because culture is such a broad term. We use that in lots of different ways. And how are we thinking about engaging with it intelligence? So maybe we just do a little definition of terms. What do we mean when we're talking about cultural intelligence?
Culture is everything and anything and everything that shapes the way we live, the environment that we're in. And I tell people when we ask the question, what's our culture? We're actually already off target. We're not dealing with a singular culture. We're dealing with the mix of cultures. And so, and I compare it to plate tectonics. So I've got to take you back to geology class, maybe even to your, undergraduate time, even before undergraduate time, maybe even back to high school. And, plate tectonics, they rub against each other. They produce pressure. They build up enough pressure, you get an earthquake. Mm-hmm. So the picture is of people of different backgrounds who've had different life experiences really rubbing up against each other, and depending on what subcultures they're a part of, there's a mix, and they're having to deal with that. So cultural intelligence is how to walk into that mix and how to interact well with that mix. The real key in the book is talking about becoming a good listener and engaging with people in a way in which your concerns and in some cases your agenda might need to be set aside for a while just to establish the relational connection you need in order to have the challenging conversations that inevitably come up because the plate tectonics are rubbing against each other and pressure could be building.
Yeah. So I love that metaphor of plate tectonics, and almost I kind of hear you saying for us as Christians, like we're sort of called to be, and in some ways we can't avoid because we're one of the plates bumping up against, but to particularly engage in those fault lines. I mean, to continue with this kind of geo metaphor, that we are at those fault lines engaging. And so when you think about a theology of cultural intelligence, like where do we see that showing up in kind of the storyline of the scripture, and how do we reflect theologically on that task, whether that's listening?
Well, I think about this in a variety of ways. I mean, the one that really is the mind-blowing one for me is I think about Daniel, who was in charge of astrologers as a Jewish believer. Just think about that for 2 seconds, okay? And then sit down and say, I'm not going to think about that much more because I don't know if I can. Or just think about the way in which the scripture talks about engagement. And the chapter that you allude to, there are 6 passages. Almost every one of them, to one degree or another, discusses not just what we believe, but how we approach the space. What is our tone? What is our manner in the way in which we engage? And so I tell people, you can be right about what you're saying and what you're thinking, but if you do it in the wrong way, you're still wrong. And so these texts, which are a theology of cultural engagement, which we don't have in the church, are a way of saying, actually, I'm challenging the whole culture war model. 1, the way we frame it. 2, the way we engage with it. And to say we probably have engaged in a way that's sufficiently biblically out of whack that we are doing ourselves and our society more damage than benefit by the way we're going about it.
Yeah. So what would you say is the right way? So if the church has kind of had this culture war posture, even that metaphor of war is maybe gets us off to the wrong start. But what would you say, okay, if that's not the right way, how should the church, and I'm even curious, this is a little bit of a follow-up question too, I'm curious if there are any churches out there that you've ever encountered that have actually written up a theology of cultural engagement for their congregation. Have you ever?
My guess is they haven't, because it doesn't exist. Okay. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I did the book. But the picture is this: there is a cultural war text in the New Testament. It is Ephesians 6. The point where it starts, however, immediately tells us we've got a problem, because that text says our battle is not, that's emphatic, against flesh and blood. Okay, but it's against the cosmic forces in the universe. One of the Greek words in that passage is the word cosmocrat. I tell people, if you think a bureaucrat is bad, you should meet a cosmocrat. So, and so it's a spiritual battle. And then our armor is our lived out faith. So it's not our politics. It's not our ideology. It isn't coming from there. It's our lived out faith as a community with one another, the way in which we engage, the tone that we bring to it, et cetera. And so I tell people, in a war metaphor, you think about a battalion facing another battalion in hand-to-hand combat. But that's not the image. If you want a military metaphor, the military metaphor I use is you're like special forces going in and rescuing someone who's in trouble. Only the issue is the person who's in trouble may not even recognize they're in trouble. So it's one thing to go in and rescue someone who's kidnapped and realizes they're in danger, they're kidnapped. It's another thing to rescue someone who's kidnapped and doesn't have a clue that they're kidnapped. And so that's the picture. And so there is a battle. It's against spiritual forces. We fight it spiritually by the way we live out spiritually as an effective testimony as light. So I tell people, when you listen to the church engage the culture, we're mostly critical of the culture and challenging the culture because the gospel does have a challenging element to it. But if I never get to the invitation and the alternative of what I'm offering, I never get to the good news, I've not shared the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to be able to ask the question, one, how do I get to the good news part of the gospel? And two, how do I do it and show it in such a way that my evangelicalism is seen as constructive or positive and not just negative? So it's those elements of tone that are important. 1 Peter 3 says, I'm supposed to be prepared to give a defense for the hope that's in me. It's interesting that the one word that Peter summarizes to summarize our faith is the word hope. Okay, that's that positive good news part.
Right.
Okay, and then he says, yet do it with courtesy and respect.
Yeah.
So it's supposed to come with a certain tone and a certain style of engagement, if I can say it that way.
Yeah.
Our speech is supposed to be seasoned with salt. We're supposed to do good to all people, whether they are a member of the faith or not. So all these texts are taking us in the same direction in terms of there's not only what we engage with, our content, but the relational dimension of our engagement. And I tend to think that conservatives fall short in their engagement, not usually because they're wrong, but because they go about it in the wrong way.
Yeah. I'm curious, what do you think sort of drives that wrong engagement? Is that a lack of a certain kind of spiritual formation? Is it a posture of fear? I mean, I'm asking you to speculate about an individual person, but if you were thinking about what is it about?
It's a series of things.
Yeah.
I think it's a combination of fear and frustration. It's fear about where the culture is going, which you hear a lot about.
That's right.
And that same 1 Peter passage tells us not to be afraid of those who push back against us for doing the right thing.
Wow.
3 times in the 1 Peter passage, there's this thing said, if you are slandered for doing good, okay, or if you do the right thing, you are blessed. Okay, I call it Bock's law. Every good deed will get punished.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the way we function in the world.
Yeah.
So we do the right thing, we get pushback from the world. Jesus told us it was coming. If you go the way of the cross, the world's going to push back. So that shouldn't surprise us. We shouldn't play the victim too much because it's kind of the calling. And in the midst of doing that, we respond not in kind. And the one thing we're not supposed to do, according to 1 Peter 3, is to be afraid of the pushback that we get. Because when you operate out of fear, you make mistakes. So you don't operate out of fear. You need to really believe that he who is in us is greater than he who's in the world. And we don't believe that passage enough.
Yeah.
So there's a frustration, there's a fear. I think there's a sense of protection in a family environment for your kids. Yeah. So there's lots of things going on, and it's a mixed bag. Some of it is a natural response and a response that gets in the way, and other parts of the response are a natural defensive mechanism, if I can say it that way, to try and do and preserve the right thing. So it's a tricky conversation, and I think we just have to recognize that as we think about what it means to be an alien in a strange land, which is another metaphor that's used for what Christians are. They're exiles in the world.
Yeah.
Our citizenship is a heavenly citizenship. We're ambassadors for God in the world. I tease people, ambassadors don't get to know the country that they're in by saying, come to my embassy and come see me. No, they go out and about and they're engaged with the country that they're in order to understand it.
Yeah. Well, because I love the ambassador metaphor as another really powerful one to think about is kind of what is the calling that we as Christians have in engaging with cultural intelligence. It's not just come, hopefully you'll see an ad or something and come to my church, my embassy, but that we ought to be sort of in our Monday lives and in all of life where we live, work, play, all of that, being engaging in those places with this lens of cultural intelligence and sort of learning the culture as well. I wonder about, as you think about the work that you've done here, it makes me think of some of the work that Leslie Newbegin has done, like in a Gospel Pro Society, or even sort of some of the work that Tim Keller had done around contextualization. There's almost a missionary kind of idea of doing contextualization work. You kind of mentioned, we haven't shared the gospel until people.
It's a cross-cultural experience.
Right.
You're in a cross-cultural environment. You're dealing with the environment that you come out of. you're dealing with someone who's not in that environment at all, or may even be hostile to that environment. And so how do you connect with that person? We don't give enough thought. We're so focused on what we want to say to people, we don't give enough thought to where they're coming from. And in order to engage with them and connect with them, we've got to take some time to figure out where they're coming from. So I tell people, when you're in an individual conversation and you're getting to know someone who isn't a believer, you want to get a spiritual GPS reading on them. You want to know what their whys and wherefores are, and how they put their life together, what drives them, what are their values, those kinds of things. So I'm in conversation. Initially, my doctrinal meter is on mute. Okay, not going to turn it off, okay, because it's going to go off. Tilt button will be there, okay? But what normally happens when you hit the tilt button is, I've got to form my rebuttal and tell them why they're wrong. No, I actually want first to figure out why they see the world the way that they do and how they put it together. Because in the midst of that, I may discover the bridges that I can focus on to have a good conversation.
Yeah.
And when I create an environment where I make the effort to get to know them and listen to their story, I also create an environment for when it's my turn, I get to tell my story.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder, so even thinking of just telling some stories there, is there a story for you that comes to mind where you've sat with someone who isn't a believer and you've tried to put some of these things into practice, or maybe maybe you can compile some stories together. But I'm just curious, what's a practical example maybe where you've
I tell people to just listen to the culture. Put your ear to the ground and listen to the culture. And the culture tells us kind of what it's wrestling with. So you hear a lot of people who will say something like, I'm trying to find myself.
Yeah.
Okay, and then a joking side of me says, well, I thought you were here all along, So, that tells you that they're trying to make sense out of their life.
Yeah.
They're trying to put it together in one way or another. And I also tell people, if you don't believe you're made in the image of God and you don't know why you're here, then your only alternative is to put together your own identity and to make sense out of what's going on around you. So that's the normal default if you don't have a Christian worldview, is to go into that space and construct the way you see life in the world. So that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
And I'm not put off by that. I say that's a natural response. I get that. Yeah, you're proudly suspended in midair. And my point is, this is the hope part. I tell people the gospel in the end is about location, just like real estate is. Okay? It's about location. Makes sense out of who you are. It gives you a purpose for life, helps you to understand what you're supposed to be about. It connects you to the creator of the world. By connected to the creator of the world, you're connected to other people who are made in his image, okay? And it gives you location.
Yeah. That's really powerful to think about the location part of that. And I wonder, you talk about kind of putting your ear to the ground, listening to the culture, some of these cultural narratives that are there, whether that's trying to find myself or the questions that people are asking. I wonder if are there any practices, habits, disciplines that we can engage in to be more effective at doing that? I mean, you mentioned listening, right? So we need to be listening without sort of having the sense of how am I immediately going to respond, just listening to listen, and then sort of wait to hopefully be asked about our own hope in some of those conversations. If we've listened well, hopefully we'll be maybe asked
back. Exactly.
Back.
So I think that what I would say is, we take a group of our students to Sundance Film Festival every year as part of our media arts program, and we are associated with that here at the center. And when we go in, I'll tell people, if you listen to art carefully, well done art, okay, or well done documentaries, what you will see is people wrestling with life questions. Okay, they're trying to make sense out of their life. They're wrestling with life questions, and you've got to strip away the distractions. A lot of entertainment is just distraction and noise, just to forget where we are. So I'm not talking about that kind of entertainment. I'm talking about films that are made that really ask life questions and what people are struggling with and wrestling with. And if you keep your ear close to the ground, you can see that they're wrestling with the value of family or the importance of legacy or the importance of there are values that pop up because even though, theology says we're totally depraved, it doesn't mean that we're as bad as we could be. It just means that we're messed up, that it's not aligned, that it's dysfunctional. But there are some things about who we are and our instincts that actually reflect having been made in the image of God and being responsive to people. Mm-hmm. And you're looking for those kinds of things because what you might find is that someone has a value that they have applied in a certain way, but you share that value with them. Mm-hmm. And you can talk about the different way in which you apply that value. And now you're not in a confrontational conversation. You're in a complementary conversation where you're talking about how do we think about living with this value that we share? Mm-hmm. Those kinds of things. So that's what you're kind of looking for. That's what the spiritual GPS is kind of looking for. There will be things that you'll hear that you go, nope, that doesn't align. That's something to deal with down the road. But you're also looking for the things where you can come alongside the person and say, you know what, I wrestle with that too, or that's a part of my life as well, and connect and do it that way. So you're always going to have this tension between the challenge of the gospel and the invitation.
Yeah.
And part of the point that I'm trying to make is that you've got to set up the relational in such a way that you can issue the challenge, okay? Mm-hmm. That's what that relational piece is designed to do. But in the end, if you don't have something positive or something aspirational to move the person towards that takes them towards the gospel and the good news, all you've done is critique them.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is even kind of when you talk about when we talked about the Peter passage a moment ago, the idea of the hope that is within us, that we need to also have something that we're positively holding out, the beauty, the goodness of this life, not just you're wrong, and let me tell you chapter and verse why you're wrong. But let me also give you an invitation into this fullness of life that Jesus, the beauty of this story. Because I think another thing I've reading and thinking more about in some of these spaces too is there was a moment in a kind of culture where the big question is Christianity true in the sense of like, can you verify historically, death and resurrection, these kinds of things. But maybe even in this moment, I think there's a lot of question about whether Christianity is good. Is this
or
good?
Is Christianity real? And what I mean by that is what we're seeing in the church that's disturbing is claims about what a Christian is and then the way the church actually acts.
Okay, yeah.
And those are not aligned, okay? So is Christianity the real deal?
Yeah.
Well, if we're sending false signals, it doesn't look like the real deal.
Yeah. So part of this, and this goes back to what you were saying around the Ephesians 6 idea, that the way that we fight the spiritual battle is by becoming more fully like Jesus in these, like living out these spiritual disciplines. And that becomes this even kind of apologetic of life and consistency of what we proclaim with how we actually live.
And we're interested in who we are and in what we're doing, and less interested in being critical of what someone else is doing. In other words, I need to reflect the alternative as I talk about the alternative.
Yeah.
And if I'm looking and acting much like the world, I tell people that when we act like the world, we turn ourselves into another special interest group. Mm-hmm. Well, there are lots of special interest groups out there, and I'll take my choice. Thank you very much.
Sure.
But if we're talking about the real Christian life and living distinctively in a reflection of who God is, and we're being distinctive, that's not a special interest group, okay? That's something different. That's something different that you're offering the world. Mm-hmm. And when we do that individually and as communities, when we serve in our communities in ways in which we cause people to ask, why are you even doing this? Mm-hmm. You don't have to be doing this. Why are you doing this? Why do you care?
Yeah.
When we generate questions like that, okay, then we have done something positive, and we've drawn people to the fact that our faith is a positive for people.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. Well, and I wonder too here as we, we're recording this in 2024. We have a presidential election coming this fall.
Nothing short of a nightmare. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, and we've seen the last two, certainly the 2020 election and all that followed there, and even 2016 was such a culture, I think, shift and surprise in so many ways for people, and how some of these things, worked out. And so I just wonder, what would you tell? I'm curious about maybe two things. What would you say to pastors leading congregations in this election season? What would you say to pastors? And then maybe also, how would you encourage individual Christians in their various spaces to engage well in this season?
If our commitment to Christ isn't the most important thing in our relationship, something's wrong.
In our relationship to one another?
Regardless of how I think about how I apply that.
Yeah.
If I have a brother and sister in Christ, and I am more interested in what their political position is than the fact that they are a brother and sister in Christ, I've got a problem.
Yeah.
That's the starting point. There are reasons why people wrestle with application. We live in a fallen, dysfunctional world. I tell people political issues come in three packages. And one of them is genuine worldview clash.
Okay.
There are actually very few issues that are fully genuine worldview clashes. And so I think the abortion discussion, the same-sex marriage are genuine worldview clashes. You're starting from such different places. Finding common ground is very hard. It happens to be two of the issues the church cares a lot about. And so as a result, it gets a lot of reaction because it operates, in that space. But a second kind of issue is what I call same goal, different route.
Okay.
Same goal, different route is the idea of if I walk out on the street and ask the question, should the races be reconciled? Okay, because race is a controversial topic.
Right.
Okay. Should the races be almost everyone will say yes, that ideally the races should be reconciled to one another. I ask the second question, how's that going to happen? Now we're in our conversation.
Right.
But at least we share the same goal.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's a different conversation than when there's just a head-to-head collision.
Yeah.
Most of our political issues, however, are not of either of those two groups, I don't think. Most of our political issues are what I call colliding values. We live in a fallen world. By definition, fallenness means things are dysfunctional. That means that there can be values, even values of merit, that collide because they're not aligned. That's what dysfunction is. Mm-hmm. And so we have these values that are colliding around a particular issue that we're discussing. And what happens in our politics because of our polarization and because of our binary structure, I'm all right and you're all wrong, or, it's all this and not that. Yeah. We make it a raw binary. We sometimes elevate it to a worldview clash. We demonize the person who's on the other side, and we've killed any opportunity for any conversation that means anything.
Yeah.
Instead, we ought to be thinking these values are colliding to one another. They're not aligned. And then what happens in our politics is each party picks the value that they want to rotate around and focus on, and they tend to belittle or minimize the other value that's colliding with it and almost pretend that it doesn't exist or isn't a part of the conversation. And we rob ourselves of the conversation that we need, which is, how do I align these values to one another that are in conflict? How do I do that? I don't do it by dismissing one of the values. I do it by recognizing and asking the question from every side, what's the best way to align these things? Yeah. What's a solution for this problem that will bring them into better alignment and will fix it better? And I do it with an awareness that maybe there's something coming from the other person that I need to take seriously.
Yeah.
And if I have that conversation with that kind of an attitude, I will have a different kind of conversation than if I walk into it and say, I've got everything all right and they are 100% wrong. Yeah. And so you ask me, what do I say to pastors? To pastors, I will say, you stress the fact that when you're in a worship service and you're sitting next to brothers and sisters in Christ, regardless of what they think politically, their relationship to Christ and their relationship to one another as a result is the most important thing that's happening in the room. And then the second thing that you do is you create an environment in which there's the opportunity to perhaps do some listening and do some respecting of why someone else is coming from a different position. It doesn't mean you're going to agree, and it doesn't mean that there's not going to be a difficult conversation. But how you approach that conversation makes all the difference in the world. And how you approach hearing things that you may not agree with makes all the difference in the world. So how do I do that with, and now I'm back to 1 Peter 3, courtesy and respect.
Yeah.
And if I don't teach the attitudes that come with the conversation and I just think about being right or wrong, I'm going to mess up.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Well, and those three categories that you gave of genuine worldview clash, what was the second one? Can you remember that one?
So same goal, different route.
Same goal, different route, and then competing values.
Yeah.
As you were walking through the competing values conversation, the issue that came to my mind there, which has been an issue for, a long time, but over the last 20, 30 years is border security and immigration.
Immigration is the example.
Yeah.
Okay? Because on the one hand, you have a lot in the Bible about showing compassion to people who aren't in their home.
Right.
Okay? And or how to deal with the foreigner in the land. There's a lot of stuff in the Bible on that. But a society has a right to decide what kind of society it's going to be. A society has a right to expect that its laws are going to be followed.
Yeah.
Okay. But then I think the indication that we're not in a good place on this is the way we handle the children who have been born, who've never lived outside the United States in their life, and maybe they were born to people who are here illegally, et cetera. But we're a policy that says what we ought to do is deport those kids, to me, just doesn't have the right relational feel to it. Because this has been their home from life through no fault of their own.
That's right. Yeah.
And so why we can't devise a policy as a first step to deal with them is, to me, shows the fault of our inability to govern.
Yeah.
Okay. And now I'm moving into political space, which I'm not always comfortable doing. But it raises the question: what spirit are we bringing to this conversation?
Yeah.
I know. Yes, there are people who come in who shouldn't be here, who are dangerous, who produce a problem. But when you generalize that, I'm also aware of people who are here who have live their lives, who take care of homes, who work 2 and 3 jobs just to survive, who live in an apartment with 2 or 3 families together because that's the only way they can afford how to do it, et cetera. They don't do anything wrong. All they want to do is just live their life.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do we do with those people? And how do we distinguish that? And how do we develop a policy that's aware of those differerences? And how do we give them a route to get there? All those kinds of things that don't exist right now.
That's right.
That need to exist.
Well, and that's where that language of competing values is so helpful, and recognizing that there are multiple important biblical values there. And I think what I heard you saying earlier is that our tendency is to absolutize one of those values.
Exactly right.
And
deny the other one.
Right. And so I think even having
kills the conversation.
Yeah.
Just a killer.
Yeah.
Because the other side is valuing the reverse order.
Right.
And now the question is, the discussion we need to have is, how do I align these values that are not aligned? Okay? I'm in a dysfunctional world. They're not aligned. I shouldn't be surprised. I'm in a fall. How do we make it better?
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, this is really helpful, and I think I feel probably with a lot of people the weight of this moment, and for us doing this well as Christians, and the ways that we as the church collective have often failed in this realm. But I think I take also great hope in this. In Jesus' words, that He hasn't left us alone, that He sent us a helper, that we in any one of those conversations, we are never by ourselves. Even if it's just me and the other person, the Holy Spirit is also always there. I'm never alone. And I think that's so key.
Another important part of this is we've got to be humble.
Yeah.
Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the peacemakers. The very characteristics of the Beatitudes.
Yeah.
That show that I am caring for the great commandment is I'm supposed to love my neighbor as myself, and that love which makes Christianity distinctive is not just aimed at those who love me.
Yeah, that's right.
Jesus made the point. If you do that, you're just like the world.
Yeah, everybody does that. Everybody loves the people who are like them.
Yeah. No, the test is how you respond to the person who pushes back against you.
Yeah.
The test is what you do with your enemy. The test is what you do with the other.
Yeah.
And sometimes what I'm suggesting is in our conversations with someone who we may feel like is an other, is that maybe by getting to ask questions and approaching them in the way that I'm talking about, we find out they may not be as much other as we think. They may be more like us.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, I think we should wrap it here. I would love to just keep going because this is so good. But for all of our sake of our time, honoring your time, I want to wrap it up here. But before we do that, I do want to ask you, we always like to ask our guests this one final question, just as kind of a get to know a little bit more about you. But you've obviously had this incredible career in scholarship and academia and teaching in the seminary and pastoral ministry and cultural leadership, all of this. But is there a hobby, or if you could go back and just get another chance to live another life, is there a career path that is like
doing what I should be doing? I'm doing what I should be doing. I have, my hobby is sports, global sports. I have teams I root for literally around the world. I joke with my wife, I could start at 2 a.m. with Aussie rules football on a Saturday, and I could go all day beyond when the sun sets and just follow the sports around the world. I'm a cricket fan. I'm all sports here, the U.S., soccer, baseball, basketball, football, all levels. My son gives me a hard time because I even like women's sports and women's basketball. So I'm a pretty fanatic sports fan in just about every way. The only sport that I don't connect with is darts.
Okay. Why darts? What do you have against darts?
If you go to Britain, you'll understand why I say that, because they actually broadcast darts matches on television.
Okay.
And I actually have a philosophical question about darts, and that is, I really wonder if it's a sport. Okay, I can understand what's going on with this arm in terms of showing the dart at the dartboard, but it's what's going on with the other arm that makes me question whether it's a sport.
Okay. Well, I love that. Well, Dr. Bock, thank you so much for taking this time with us, and we will have links to your books, resources, and all that kind of thing in the show notes, so people can track down both the cultural intelligence books, but all of the other great work that you have out there, and we'll link to the various centers and that kind of thing that you're a part of there at DTS. So, again, thanks so much for taking the time with us. It's an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure, Bill. Anytime.